I appreciate you all for coming out to this kickoff of something we do yearly. We've done it for what, Courtney? Last 8 years, 7 years, 9 years? 9 years. The President's Symposium and White Paper Project. We choose a topic, something that will advance the university, and then in a competitive process, we ask students, in addition to everything they need to do, to work that topic. And at the end of the year, give us a set of recommendations so that we can make the place better. When I came in 2010, one of the first things I did as president was to undertake a strategic planning process. We really, at UMB, never had a formal strategic plan before. There wasn't a document, something that was drafted and endorsed by the entire body, which you need to do in order to make a strategic plan work, something that set our direction, marked our progress as an institution. We thought that formalizing a plan developed by the various constituencies at UMB would, in a sense, unify our work across schools, give us a common purpose, common goals, give us something to use as a guideline for prioritizing what we want to do first, what we want to do second. And even though this may sound corny, the 140 people representing people like yourselves that worked on the plan said that we needed pillars before we could construct a plan. Pillars meaning principles, values that we would never forsake. Values need to be permanent. Strategic plans can change. Values that form the underpinning on how we do what we do, how we accomplish our work, and maybe even more importantly, how we interact with one another, with the community, internally, externally, with our constituents writ large. And these became the stuff that you see plastered up all over, painted on the garage walls, our core values, the values that identify us as UMB, the stuff that we stand for. Those values don't dictate what we do, but they should dictate how we do it. We said that in every activity, every initiative, every program, we would value accountability, civility, collaboration, diversity, excellence, knowledge, and leadership. That was the set of core values that we agreed upon. So now it's nearly 10 years since we enshrined these values. And frankly, some of the people instrumental in their selection aren't even here anymore for very good reasons. I'm not going to be here forever. And if I may say it, neither are you. For the students, maybe some days it feels like you will be here forever, but I promise you won't. So here's the deal. If we still believe that these are our values, our unique UMB values, if we still believe that everything we do must be undertaken with these values as our guide, then we need a way to steward them, to protect them, to make sure that the values endure even if we do not. And that's why you're here. Now, while the privilege today to introduce our kickoff keynote speaker lies with one of our fellows, Miss Annika Harriet, I do, if you don't mind, want to say just a few words about Norm Augustine, one of this nation's very finest leaders in all ways, and a person whom I hugely admire. Mr. Augustine believes in our core values. He was very supportive to me as a regent of the University System of Maryland in encouraging the importance of values to an organization. And in fact, he spoke to our value of leadership a few years ago in this very room. And now he's graciously accepted our invitation to be UMB's first ever President's Distinguished Scholar. In one facet of this role, he's going to help the President's Fellows, who are sitting here in the front, representing the schools. He's going to help them figure out how we institutionalize our values, how we assure their permanence as our guiding light. I imagine most of you recognize what an incredible honor has been bestowed upon us by having Mr. Augustine do this, because I can guarantee you that UMB is hardly the first organization to help Mr. Augustine for help. He's called upon by our country's highest officials again and again to solve America's biggest problems of science, innovation, economic competitiveness. He's called on not only because of his long experience and deep knowledge, but because he is incredibly capable of being able to see clearly the landscape of our challenges and to bring people together around ambitious yet achievable solutions. In short, and now I hope you're beginning to understand why we asked him to speak on leadership, one of our values, he's valued for his extraordinary leadership. I read once, Norm, that when you get these calls to be of service, you accept those that meet at least one of the following three criteria. I hope this is true, because this is what I learned. Number one on Norm's list, regarding whether he'll say yes or no, it advances a cause he believes in. Number two, and I hope I fit into this somehow, he'd be helping out a friend if he said yes. And number three, he thinks it's something that'll be fun. So I do hope, Norm, at the end of this year, you'll say that answering our humble call met all three of your criteria. So I thank all of you for believing that our values matter, all of you who are here, for believing that they're central to our UMB identity, and that in fact they do deserve our attention, our fidelity, our guardianship. The work you undertake today will ensure UMB's integrity and impact for years to come. It's that important, and I thank you for taking it on. And now, it's my pleasure. I love when the students drive us. It's my pleasure to introduce Miss Annika Harriet, who is a PhD candidate, come on, in the biochemistry and molecular biology program in our School of Medicine, the real deal scientist. And she is going to, better than I could, thank you for letting me make a few personal remarks, introduce our keynote speaker. Annika.
Thank you. So as you already heard, our speaker today is Mr. Norm Augustine. Mr. Augustine is a retired chairman and CEO of Lockheed Martin and served as Under Secretary of the Army, chairman of the American Red Cross, President of the Boy Scouts, Chairman of the National Academy of Engineering, Defense Science Board, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He is a holder of the National Medal of Technology and a 5-time recipient of the Department of Defense Civilian Distinguished Service Medal. Mr. Augustine is a recipient of 35 honorary doctorates and served as a trustee of Princeton, MIT, and Johns Hopkins, and as regent for the University System of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Augustine.
Well, thank you, Annika, for that very kind introduction. That and the President's remarks were so generous. It reminded me of my first day on the faculty at Princeton, where up until that time I'd spent my entire career either in industry or in government. And I was asked to give the welcoming lecture to the incoming engineers. The dean was making his own introductory remarks on the occasion. Frankly, I wasn't paying much attention. I was flipping through my notes, and all of a sudden I heard the dean say, "And now we will hear from Professor Augustine." And this is absolutely true. For just an instant, the thought went through my mind, geez, what a coincidence. They've got some guy here by the same name as me. So thank you for all those kind words. And I'm truly pleased to be here with you all. That's an understatement. And congratulations to the President's Fellows. I look forward to working with you all this year and others in this room. I'm very excited about the opportunity that I've been kindly given. I would also have to take note, obviously, today is a day that we all remember very deeply, 9/11, which was a day that really highlighted values and the role of values that many of us admire so much. And I'm sure everybody in this room remembers where you were on 9/11. I was on a train traveling alone on the border of Afghanistan. I'm a train buff, and that was not a good place to be that particular day. And so I can tell you that I really am pleased to be here with you today. Our topic is values, and when the President asked me to speak on this subject, my initial reaction was, what do I have to say about values? I make no claims of special competence. I have no degrees in philosophy. I've gathered a lot of scar tissue in my career, which probably is helpful. And at one time, I even had hair. But it's a little like the Farmers Insurance Company ad that I'm sure you've all seen more times than you probably like, that says, we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. And I'm not sure I know a thing or two, but I've sure seen a thing or two, and I'd like to share some of those things with you today. I'm going to use some real examples to try to put some meat on the philosophy here. And my examples, I've tried to be discreet, but they're based on publicly available information. But they're things that have happened mostly to me in my career. And I guess I really do, I'm sure you've got reason to question, what does an engineer like myself have talking about values? You all know the definition of an engineer. An engineer is a person who's good at numbers, but doesn't have the personality to be an accountant. And now that I've alienated two groups in this room, we'll go ahead. But don't forget, I am a rocket scientist, so take that in mind. I want to start, and I didn't know that the President would be here today, but I did want to start by congratulating UMB President Perman for this program, which, among the many other things that this institution has to be proud of, sort of distinguished it, the emphasis on values. And the very few other universities all have values, but where they continually remind themselves of them with programs such as the programs that have been set up here. And I'm just very pleased and proud to be a small part of it. My own perspective that I'm going to share is kind of derived from 4 different careers I've led. One was as an engineering business person. One was a government employee. One was with charitable organizations, and The other was a career in academia, very briefly as a professor at Princeton, and as you heard, various boards of trustees. My own perspective, again, is that many organizations that we admire have very different personalities, but they share certain common values, or pillars, as you call them. I like that word, pillars. The same is true of the quality people I've known in my life. As I think about it, they shared certain common values. And I looked at, over the years, a lot of different definitions of values and culture and so on. You can see a lot of different ones. I've concluded that values are principles of behavior, and that culture is simply the way things were traditionally done. And that's oversimplified, but it gives us a starting point. And I must confess to you that earlier in my career, I did not believe in culture. People talked about it's the culture or something. I viewed that kind of a statement as an excuse for not getting the job done. And boy, have I changed my mind. What I've learned over the years is that culture is a very powerful way of getting a job done and getting it done right. And I used to say to the people in our company, I worked in a company that, like many of the people here, did some pretty amazing things. I used to say how proud of them of what they had done, but I was even more proud of how they had done it. And that's kind of the distinction that I want to talk about a little bit today. Values really are a sense of principles, a template, if you will, that when you have a tough decision to make, hopefully you'll be mindful enough that you can hold these values up and lay the decision against it and see if they match. And if they don't match, you want to think about it a long time. Ethics that we talk about a lot are, in my mind, a part of values, or a particular part of values that are based on moral beliefs. Then there are vision statements. Most every organization has a vision statement. Most people don't, maybe in the back of their mind, but they don't write it down. But most organizations do have a relatively carefully thought out vision statement. And I found that writing vision statements is a lot harder than you'd think. The kind of thing I used to run into, and I'll use a different example here, I'll use a football coach who's putting down the vision for the coming season. And we ought to make it the Ravens since we're here. So the Ravens coach puts down his vision, which is to have no fumbles this season. Well, that sounds like a pretty good thing to do. The problem is there isn't a player on the team that'll believe that's possible. Never been done, never close. And so why do you put up a goal that everybody knows you can't reach? And so is it worth trying? Because we're going to fail. On the other hand, the coach says, okay, we want to this year have no more than 10 fumbles. Does that mean it's okay to have 10 fumbles? And so how you word these things gets to be awfully important in terms of how they motivate people. For our purposes anyway, let's define values as principles of behavior or of conduct, and culture as a way things traditionally get done. There's a real danger here that's lurking in the background, and that is that when the values don't match the culture, that's when you get in real trouble. And there are plenty of examples of that. We'll cite a few of them. Organizations are a lot like people. They really do have personalities. And when you're around an organization a little while, you very quickly discover its personality. There are 12 great institutions in the university system of Maryland, but each one has a very distinct personality that if you're around them a little bit, you begin to recognize them. And I might also say they, to a very large degree, reflect the leadership of the organization. Just to compare something that we're all familiar with, compare flying on Southwest Airlines with flying on United Airlines. Both great airlines, both been around quite a while, both profitable airlines, but the experience on the two is entirely different. And why is that? And I think one reason, a fellow by the name of Herb Kelleher, who we lost Herb this year, happened to be a friend of mine. Herb started Southwest Airlines. And one of Herb's strong beliefs is that a job ought to be fun. You ought to be able to enjoy your job. No matter how hard or how important it is, you ought to be able to enjoy it. And he pervaded that culture throughout the entire Southwest Airlines, that every time you get on an airplane, you're just struck immediately, I'm in a different world here. Another example, when I lived in Texas, there was a major highway not too far from us, and there were two gas stations on opposite sides of the road. They both were major brands. They both carried quality gas, as far as I know. The prices were identical, and one of the filling stations, the one across the street, was always almost empty. And the one I went to, you always had to stand in line to get your gas. And there was an old guy that ran this filling station I went to, and most everybody else did. And one day I commented to him, I said, how come there's nobody at the station across the street? And he said, oh, they're in a different business than we're in. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, they're a filling station, we're a service station. And everybody in that place understood the difference between the two. And just little things he did. For example, for his regular customers, when you bought gas, he didn't make you pay cash and go through your credit card. He would write down what you owe this day. And at the end of the month, he would take your credit card and give you one bill for the whole month so you could get your gas and go. Little things like that. A lot of examples that we can learn from that are failures in the business world and government and in academia. Probably all those places, as I said, had value statements. Hopefully they did. Core values being the values we hold most dearly. I think of the problems that great institutions like Penn State, Michigan State, North Carolina, or corporations, Enron, Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, and so on down the line, all had values, but what went wrong? And what went wrong was the culture didn't match the values. When I speak in business schools on the subject of business ethics, I kind of assume the students are not going to be overly whelmed with that as a topic. The alternative for me is to give them my lecture on the second law of thermodynamics, and if I threaten that, then they like the business ethics part. And anyway, I always start my lectures with the following, and I tell the students I'm going to give you some numbers, and then I'm going to ask you a little quiz, and the quiz is, what are those numbers? And so the numbers I share with them, and this goes back a little while, Swiss First Boston, 1.5, Imclone, 7, Rite Aid, 8, Westars, 18, Adelphia, 15, Dynergy, 24, Tyco, 25, WorldCom, 25, and Enron, 165. And so the students want to hold up their hands and say, is that their stock prices? I say, no, that's not their stock prices. Somebody else will say, well, is that somehow related to their return on investment? No, that's not what that is. And when they all give up, I say, those are the number of years that their chief executive was sentenced to prison. All of a sudden, I have credibility, and people were willing to listen for a little while. And I'm sad to say that I've had several friends and acquaintances who wound up in prison. They were fundamentally decent people who made one humongous mistake because they didn't take values and put on against those values the decision I'm about to make. And they made one fateful decision, and then sometimes that led to other fateful decisions. My friends were CEOs of Fortune 100 companies. They were people who worked in the White House for the president. They were people, one was a Deputy Secretary of Defense, and they made one humongous mistake. They didn't stop to think. That's where values come in. I think of a friend who was Deputy Secretary of Defense and previously had run a large company. When he was running that large company, he was a married man, and his first mistake, he had a girlfriend on the side, and he told the girlfriend about a deal the company was about to undertake to buy another company. The girlfriend, it turned out, had another boyfriend and told the boyfriend. The boyfriend was a very smart but not ethical fellow and saw the opportunity in this. So he goes out on Thursday night, borrows every penny he can, buys stock in the company that's the target or the acquiree. Typically in an acquisition, your stock will jump 30, 40% overnight if it's a decent acquisition. And So he buys stock with every dollar he can borrow. On Friday night, they announced the acquisition. Monday afternoon, just before the market closes, he sells his stock and pays back his loan. Makes a ton of money. The problem is that the computers at the Securities Exchange Commission say, here's a guy who's never bought a share of stock in his life. He buys on Thursday, sells on Monday, and makes a fortune. And it turns out it's a deal that's being done. And when you're an insider of deals like that, there's a huge sum of money to be made if you're unethical and illegal. And the computers at the SEC highlighted this fellow. In about 2 minutes, my friend went to jail for several years. The fellow and the girl had to give back the money, and they're no longer allowed to deal in stocks, which wasn't much of a loss to them, apparently. When I was teaching, I used to try to go out of my way to say that I would not try to impose my values on anyone else, because I don't know that mine are any better or any worse than anyone else's. The only thing I wanted to convey was that you do face questions that have ethical and values content, and be ready to recognize them when you face them. Stop and think. An example of where this worked well, another friend, Jim Burke, he ran Johnson & Johnson some years ago. You may recall the Tylenol, the younger one in the room probably won't, but the Tylenol murders, where Tylenol capsules that were put in drugstores were tampered with, and the Tylenol was replaced with, I think it was cyanide. And I believe it was 7 people died from the tampered Tylenol. So the question that comes to Jim, the CEO of Johnson & Johnson, 7 people have died using your product. You've got 30 million bottles, or 30 million capsules, I guess it was, out in the supply chain. Should you call them all back and get them back and make sure that everything's okay? The lawyers told him that might be a good thing to do, but if you do it, it will give the impression of some sense of responsibility for what's happened here. And that could be damaging to our legal case. The finance people said if you call all those bottles back, it will crater our stock price and undermine our very best product, Tylenol. Another group at the company told him that you have no responsibility for these. When the Tylenol left our plant, it was perfectly good Tylenol. It was tampered with after it left the plant. And you can't be responsible for every capsule of Tylenol that wanders around the world. Jim made the decision to recall all these capsules. And ever since then, for many years after that, Johnson & Johnson became the gold standard of ethics and culture and values in industry. And when I asked him, I said, how did you ever make a tough decision like that? He said it was actually very easy. He said, we have been talking about our values, just as your president has. We've been talking about them so long in front of everybody, in front of our customers, the media, our employees. He said, there was no way I could not have recalled. We keep saying the one thing we care about is our customers' safety. That's what we care about. That's why we're here. And he said it was an easy decision. He had no choice because of the set of values they had and that they had been very public about. I thought it was an interesting perspective. I'll give you an example from my own life where our corporate values were very helpful. We had an employee, a very senior employee, who did something that was, everybody in this room would agree was wrong, unethical, seriously unethical. Thank goodness it was not illegal. Ethics is generally a tougher standard than legality. And much to my dismay, I was running the company, much to my dismay, I learned about it through a story on the front page of the Washington Post, which is not the way you like to find out what's going on in your company. So I had 2 strikes against me. The third strike was that Congressman John Nagel, who at that time ran what was called the Surveys and Investigations Committee, decided this would be a great place to have an investigation. I had the good fortune that he decided I would get to be the witness at the congressional investigation. John and his staff were famous for being junkyard dogs when it came to getting a hold of something like this. I mean, this was raw meat for them. Before I knew about their planning to have a hearing, I thought we better find out the rest of the story. And so I asked a law firm that was the person who led the investigation was a former head of the FBI, and ran an investigation to see was there more to this story. And after a few weeks, he came back and said he was sorry to tell me, but there was more to the story, and it was probably a little bit worse than the half I knew. He told it to me. So the hearing is scheduled for me to be the witness. And I went down on Capitol Hill to meet with Congressman Dingell, Chairman Dingell, like a week before the hearing. And we sat in a little outer office. And I said that I really am embarrassed to have to tell you that everything you read in the newspaper was true. And that we had an independent investigation done, and there's half of the story that you don't know. And I'm going to tell it to you, and it's something we're not proud of either. And I said, this is not typical of our company, and this is what we've done to the individual, and this is what we've done to try to be sure this will never happen again. And I think I can give him a high probability that this sort of thing won't happen again in our company. And I looked over, he hadn't interrupted me, and I looked over at him, and he was smiling. And the first words out of his mouth I will never forget was, "This is no fun." And he said, "How am I going to have a hearing if you're going to do that?" He said, "I've got to have all morning on TV to drag this out of you." And believe it or not, he canceled the hearing, and John and I became lifelong friends until he passed on. We really did, over just that one incident. And I could have gone in and denied this and that and tried to cover it, and he would have killed me. And it was an example of a real-world case. One of the real challenges of setting standards is that just one person in a big organization like UMB can undo an awful lot of the good that everybody else has done. And so you have to get that last individual and try to get them on board. The oldest bank in England, the Barings Bank, was brought down by a single trader in Singapore. A couple of handfuls of people at Arthur Andersen cost 82,000 people their jobs in the accounting firm. And that was a firm that had been the gold standard of accounting for many years. It doesn't exist anymore. So basically values, I think, provide an anchor for an organization, and they provide guidelines for making difficult organizational decisions, difficult personal decisions. And they won't necessarily make decision making any easier. In fact, they'll probably make it harder, but they'll lead to a lot better decisions, both personally and organizationally. And every time I used to watch a rocket that we had built take off from the launch pad, the friends who were astronauts sitting on top of this, below them is 24 equivalent swimming pools of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, bad stuff when you mix it together. And I wanted to be sure that there wasn't an employee somewhere who said they had run a test when they hadn't, or an employee who said they had checked the pedigree of certain hardware and they really hadn't, or that they hadn't checked a line of software code that had it validated independently. And with millions of lines of codes and 100,000 parts on that rocket, there's so many opportunities for things to go wrong. And an example in the Mariner 1 program, a rocket to Venus, we didn't build it, fortunately. A rocket going to Venus, the planet Venus, someone left out a single dash, actually it was an overbar, a single dash in a line of backup code that wasn't intended to be used in flight, although it turned out it was. It cost the mission a failure, and when last seen, that payload was out exploring space on its own, having passed by Venus with no interest. As I see it, establishing organizational standards, core values, has really 4 phases. The first phase is to create a set of values. When I was at Martin Marietta and first became CEO, that was a predecessor to Lockheed Martin, frankly, I wasn't wise enough, and I didn't even think to make a set of values, but I did sit down and say to myself, what are the things I want to talk to the employees about that we're going to stand for? And I had 3 things. One, we'll operate ethically, we'll take care of our customers, we'll teach all people with respect. And whenever I talked to a group of employees, I always talked about those 3 things before whatever else I talked about. And it was so important to have people aware of this. And I was talking at a group of Wall Street analysts, and I said that, and at the question period, one of them said, you didn't mention profit. Do you not care about profit? And I said that if you do those 3 things, it seems like profit pretty well takes care of itself. And I think that's true. Value statements have been said to be the soul of an organization. I think that's a great description in terms of just how important they are. And a great place in creating value statements, which is step 1, as I said, is to look at statements of other organizations you admire, to write down the attributes of people you admire. I once did that. I made a list of the people I most admired and what it was about them that I admired. Their patterns, strong patterns. Look at the golden rule, stated by many different religions. You can also learn a lot from other people's failures. Unfortunately, there are plenty of examples of that. Al Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming, said that if you take the high road in Washington, you'll never be troubled by traffic. And indeed, there's plenty of opportunity to study others and see what you wish you wouldn't do. Excuse me. And as I said, stating values is really dangerous, because if you state values and you violate them, not only do you lose credibility, but you point yourself out as people who don't believe in the things you say in the first place. And credibility is the coin of the realm. The second step is to convey those values that you've agreed upon. And they're best agreed upon, too, incidentally, not by the CEO sitting down or the president sitting down. They're best done by a group of people at all levels in the organization. That way you get more buy-in and you get better values defined. Anyway, to convey them, in other words, institutionalize the core values. We found that putting out a statement of core values is most effective when it's accompanied by a discussion or a little booklet of actual examples that lead you to tough decisions in our own environment, business or education or what have you, that the reader can read and say, gee, what would I do in that case? And then it's discussed. And then, of course, if you want to have a statement of values, that's of little use unless you get the culture to follow it. And you can't change culture by putting out a memo saying Friday afternoon at close of business, the new culture is, and a list. That doesn't work. Changing culture is hard. It's really hard. And one of the first lessons along the way is don't try to preach your values. I use the word preach. And I feel I'm a little guilty of preaching here today, and I apologize for that. But the best is to provide examples and to live by those examples. Another trivial case study. Years ago, I was running the astronautics group of Martin Marietta, out headquartered in Colorado. And we had run on a tough patch in business. And we had a lot of people who were working night and day. When business is tough, that's when your people work the hardest. And anyway, it was clear to me we didn't have money for our managers to fly first class anymore. They're going to fly coach. They were working so hard, I didn't have the heart to put out a memo saying from here on you fly coach. These were people, they'd fly somewhere in the morning, they'd work all day and fly home at night so that they didn't have to waste the next day traveling and a hotel room. So what I did was I just started flying coach. I never said a word about it to anybody. And within about a month, everybody was flying coach and nobody was complaining. And example is so powerful that it speaks for itself. Values start at the top and they work their way down. Also, you have to share your values with everyone. Hopefully they buy in. The first day that Lockheed Martin existed, when we put the two companies together, every manager, it was like 300 people, received a FedEx with our values in it. Every employee received in the mail, postal mail, a statement of our values. That was 182,000 people, 180,000 people. And sending something as important as values out on the email, people discount it, they ignore it. But if they get a FedEx, they read it. People are, of course, fascinated by core values when you put them in the real world. When I was in college, I took a course in Greek philosophy, which I truly enjoyed. But I've discovered that most employees are not terribly excited by what Socrates said. And so case studies, real values, examples in the real world just are so powerful. We ran into an interesting example here. The woman who ran our ethics program, very highly respected individual as a person. She happened to be an attorney. And you may be familiar, I'm sure, with the cartoon Dilbert. And Dilbert was always beating up on industry. The management always looked stupid, and the employees were brilliant, and the management was always on the wrong path of doing everything. And the woman who was running our ethics program wrote to Scott Adams, who writes Dilbert, and says, "You're always beating up on management. Some of us out here trying to do the right thing. Why don't you help us?" And darn if she doesn't get a letter back from Scott Adams saying, "How can I help?" And so she went back, and he did a couple things for us that were really terrific. One was that I want to mention was that I mentioned this reluctantly, he made a video on the subject of values, our corporate values, and it featured Dogbert and me. And so Dogbert is telling me, and I'm made to look like an idiot, and of course the employees love this, and Dogbert explains to me about values and everything, and the employees love this, and they listen to it. If I were saying it, they wouldn't have paid any attention. The other thing that he let us do, and this sounds like we're demeaning values, but it didn't turn out that way. We made a board game of values, ethical decisions, and you got to move forward in 3 squares for getting the right decision or almost the right decision. And we got to use his character. So we had Dilbert and Dogbert and everybody in our values game, and they were based, the employees didn't know this, but mostly on cases that had actually occurred at our company at some point or another. So I'm having an offsite meeting with the top 300 managers in the company. And I announced at the offsite meeting, we're all going to play a game on values. And we pass out really a nice board game with boxes, groups of 3. And I can see everybody thinking, oh, here goes Norm again. We're going to play a board game at our offsite. And so we passed them out, and you heard groups of 3. And so they start playing. And pretty soon the noise in the room is so loud you can hardly hear. There are all these arguments going, well, that's not the right value, that's the wrong answer. And there was this big debate. And all of a sudden, the subject of values became something that was right at the top of everyone's consciousness. It had the most wonderful effect. You never know. Lots of symbols of things you can do. If you want to listen to people as part of your listen to others. My office was a corner office with a long, long table. And the people would sit along the table, the vice presidents at one end, and I was down here so far away I couldn't even see the speaker. And the people in the back row were the people who really knew the answers, but they were in the back row and didn't dare to speak up. And so I got a round conference table, and it made a total difference in the conversation, little things. I was on the board of Procter & Gamble. P&G always met in this beautiful boardroom that they'd had for 170 years or something like that, very successful company. And the boardroom was getting pretty old and creaky, and the carpet was coming apart. And they decided they had to redecorate the boardroom. And while they were doing that, we would hold a couple of meetings in a conference room. And so instead of having the speaker stand at a podium at the end of this long table with walnut walls, and the speaker sat at the table with us in the conference room. And our board meetings became so effective that, as far as I know, they never moved back to the boardroom. It was empty, at least for the rest of my tour there. Little things matter. Then there's the matter of living the core values, the third element. That's the hard part, walking the talk or operationalize one's values. An organization could rarely be better than its leader, but it could often be much worse. And again, implementation of core values really does start at the top. Jack Welch was the most influential leader that I ran across in the business world. He made a huge mistake later in life, but his employees really listened to what Jack had to say. He was a great leader. And what is leadership? And the best definition of leadership I've ever seen was at the British officers' graveyard at Normandy, up on the cliffs above where the troops came up those unbelievable cliffs, almost vertical. And it says on the tombstone that leadership is judgment, character, and carelessness of self. In other words, selflessness. I would make one change. I would make it judgment, it said judgment, courage. And so I would add the word character. I'd make a judgment, courage, character, and carelessness of self. And those topics seem to rise to the front in many values discussions. And as the president has pointed out, you shouldn't have to change your values, your statement of values or your ideals every time there's a new leader or every year or something like that. There may be new things that come up. But if you're having to change it all the time, Houston, you probably have a problem. An example of such a problem, again from the free world, this goes back to my days on the Procter & Gamble board, where I was the lead director for 18 years. And we had a CEO who had been very successful in the company since its beginning. It's just gone up, its stock price and everything's gone like that. Pardon me. The CEO retired at this point, and the board put in a new CEO, a guy who had been with the company a long time, really knew his way around. And one of the ideals of this company was that you listen to people, you learn from them, but particularly your customers. They're proud to know more about their customers than any of their competitors know about their customers. Just as an example, it's very rare that the senior people in a company will go down and talk to somebody at the bottom level of the customer structure. Well, at P&G, the board did that. When we go to an offsite somewhere in the world where the company had a big presence, the board would break up into groups of 2 or 3, and we would go to somebody's home. And I've sat in homes in Africa with concrete floors talking to the housewives about why they didn't buy Tide. And you learn things that you just can't believe you would never learn sitting in your office. And so one of their main features was we listened. Well, we put in a new CEO who was a guy who thought listening was a waste of time. I'll tell you how I want it done and go do it. And the stock went like that. You can't believe how fast it fell. We put in a new guy who was very dedicated. He was a very quiet guy. He listened. He wasn't a table pounder. And the stock went like that again. And I can't remember how many people, I think there were 120,000 people at P&G. We changed one person, and he'd be the first person to tell you he didn't do it. What he did was make it possible for everybody else to be at their best. On the subject of listening, I need to share one other story from my aerospace background. And I was told 45 minutes. I think I've got 10 minutes to go, if that's tolerable with you folks. Okay. A story at Lockheed Martin, our plant in Michoud, Louisiana, we built that huge orange, or huge, let's leave it color out for now, fuel tank that was the backbone of the space shuttle structure. I once figured out if you put that fuel tank on its side, the Wright brothers flight could take place entirely inside of it, truly. It's big. So we built about 10 of those fuel tanks that had been used, and we were given a contract for some more, but to take 8,000 pounds out of the weight of the fuel tank so we could carry more payload, the shuttle could. And our engineers got 7,200 pounds out, and the last 800 pounds were really hard to get. And one day a group of engineers were standing around a table. I wasn't there, I'm told this. We're standing around a table, and a young man from the factory came up, and the engineers were debating, what do we do? New material, smaller rivets, whatever. And this young man listened for a while, and finally he interjected. The fuel tank, you may recall, was white on those first 10 flights. He said, why don't you not paint the tank white? Well, there's silence. And finally some engineer says, space hardware is always painted white. That's known as culture. The young man didn't give up. He said, well, why don't you not paint that space hardware white? And there's more silence. Finally, somebody said, I wonder what that paint weighs. So there's a scramble to the computers. They come back. The paint weighed 800 pounds. And so we save paint, we save time, we save weight, and we save nuisance. And anyway, it pays to listen to everyone as a core value. Very few people go to work in the morning and say to themselves, I'm going to see what I can do today to mess up with our core values. People don't do that. They accidentally blunder into making mistakes. And there are really 4 big problems with living with your core values. One is they're a slippery slope. Second, that there are conflicts of interest to deal with. The core values in themselves may be in conflict, and there are shades of gray in interpreting core values. I'm going to touch briefly on each of these before I close. With regard to the slippery slope, one former executive at the Enron Corporation, and you all know that tragic story, he looked back on what had happened and he wrote the following, and I quote, we started off taking one hit of cocaine, and the next thing you know, we were importing the stuff from Colombia. They started out with one little accounting adjustment, and then pretty soon they had to cover for that with a bunch of other accounting adjustments. And I shouldn't say they had to, they did. The second concerns conflicts of interest. It said that people who serve 2 masters serve none. Shareholders, in the business world, you have shareholders to deal with, you have employees, you have communities, and so on. And you have these issues that come up. That how do you serve so many masters? And it may be that there's a plant that's just a loss leader that does nothing but drag the company down. You want to close it, but that means that you're going to not do it in favor of the employees who work there. And I'll tell you the toughest, most unattractive part of my job over the years was having to close plants. And at the end of the Cold War, we had to close a lot of them. And how do you serve more than one master and still abide by your principles? Tough question. The Business Roundtable, incidentally, right now is really wrestling with this, as you've read in the newspaper, no doubt. One time I was called by someone in the Pentagon. I was running Lockheed Martin, and they said they had a really important problem they hoped I'd work on, and that they needed somebody to chair this committee of people from the Defense Department and outside. They couldn't tell me what it was because it was so sensitive, but would I agree to chair it? And it met my 3 standards. And so I said yes. And so I sit down, and ahead of my story, I was working at Martin Marietta at the time, and I was responsible for operations and engineering. So I go into the Pentagon, and they give me all these security clearance things, and I sign them. And they tell me what it is. And this was back in the day, what they told me about was stealth. Well, I'd never heard of stealth. We all knew that it was good to make radar cross-sections small, but there had been a major breakthrough that wasn't known in the industry, and the word stealth wasn't known. It was highly classified. And ironically, it turned out it was Lockheed that had broken the code, and our company had not. Okay, so I've got a problem now. Back at Martin Marietta, where I'm responsible for spending the shareholders' money properly, it turns out that we're spending some money on trying to lower radar cross-section, but we missed the point. We're working on the wrong avenue. Every dollar we spend is wasted. So how do I take care of the shareholders of Lockheed Martin and abide by what I've learned because of what I've been asked to do for the government? I'll tell you what I did, and you can think about it and decide whether I did the right thing or not. Went back to the company and gathered the group of people who worked for me on this issue and said that because of the workload, I'm going to disqualify myself from 3 or 4 areas. And these are the areas, and one of them turned out was what was known as stealth. And I said, I'm going to delegate that to my assistant, and that person will handle those areas, and I'll handle the rest. And so I disqualified myself and stayed out of it. Was that fair to the Martin Marietta shareholders? Probably not, but it was the best I could think of. So if you get a better idea, let me know. Then there is the issue of shades of gray. I was a mid-manager at LTV. And by shades of gray, I mean circumstances where it's not clear what is the right thing to do. It's hard enough to do the right thing when you know what it is. It's really hard when you don't know what it is. So you've got shades of gray. Example, so I'm working at the LTV Corporation. I'm a mid-level manager, yet fairly young. And one staff meeting, one Monday morning that I'm holding, one of my group, an older fellow, been with the company a long time, highly admired employee, we were behind on delivering an electronics box to fly in space. And he was working Saturday night on his own, not being paid, trying to help get caught up, and he's in the laboratory. And one of the rules we had in the company, and we had rules that you were supposed to follow, and everybody knew what they were, was when you moved space hardware, you put it on a cart. And the cart had accelerometers and thermistors on it so you could know the temperature in the environment that the hardware had been exposed to when it was being moved around. Well, it's late at night, Saturday night. He's got one more test to run on a shake machine. It's the hardware sitting on the bench. And he says, I'll just pick it up, carry it over there. During my staff meeting, which is the first I hear about it, he tells me this story, and he said, I dropped it. And he said, I looked at it and I couldn't see any damage of any kind. I ran the simple tests, and they all passed, but I'm not just sure. And with that, everybody looks at me like, what's Norm going to do? And I think to myself, what's Norm going to do? And once again, I'll tell you what I did. You can judge. At that point, I said, well, John and I will sit down together this week and we'll discuss it. In the next staff meeting, I'll tell you what we decided. So the next staff meeting, I explained that John knew the rules. He broke the rules. The rules were there for a good reason. You're not supposed to break the rules. He and I have co-signed a memo stating exactly what he did, what happened. He knows better, and put it in his personnel file. And then I handed him a $500 check for his honesty and said that we rank honesty above dropping things. And then I quickly said, don't everybody run out here and drop a box for $500. It doesn't work that way. But those are the shades of gray decisions that if you have standards, make it easier. And sadly, good decisions don't guarantee good outcomes, but so be it. And I was going to give some examples, but I'll save a little time here. Lastly, it's important to do is to monitor how you're doing on your values program. Are people living up to the ideals? So I'm flying on a commercial airplane one day, and there's a young man sitting next to me, and before we take off, he introduced himself. I introduced myself. Neither of us recognized either's name. And he says he works for Lockheed Martin. And I said, oh, really? I do too. And I said, how do you like working for the company? He said, I really like it a lot, except my boss violates all the company's values. He's really an unethical person. And of course, my heart sinks at that point. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, just the other day, I was in a negotiation with a subcontractor for a contract that the bid the subcontractor gave us was $9 million. My boss told them that we've only got $8 million in the line item for this. That's all we've got. Truthfully, he said we had $10 million in the line item, so he was lying. Well, was that a shade of gray? I mean, certainly honesty, but do you have to tell the other side your negotiating position, or are you not allowed to stretch a little bit? Most marketing people would say what he did was perfectly all right, and this young man felt it was wrong. And it was very sobering. These things are not easy in many cases. What happens when you find violations? You can't ignore them. You've got to address them. And I'm very proud of the company I used to work for. This was after I left. There was a fellow who was going to, this was in the newspapers, a fellow who was going to become CEO of the company. And the company had spent 5 years grooming this individual. They announced he was going to become CEO 6 weeks before he was to take the job. Shortly after they announced it publicly, introduced him to Wall Street, and the media, and so on, it turns out he's had an affair with an employee. Our rules are you don't have affairs with people who work for you. And so the board fired him. Boom, like that. And what a message it was. It was like a shot fired through the entire corporation that you can be the next CEO and they'll fire you for not following our principles. It was a shame to lose a talented person. Unfortunately, the person who took over was probably even more talented. But it was a great example to make a point of what we really do believe. So in conclusion, in setting values, you often have to deal with changing cultures. And I found that there are three kinds of people when it comes to change. There are people who thrive on it, that are excited by it, new opportunities, do new things. The second category of people who say, oh, I can live with that. The third category are people who just absolutely can't live with that. And to put it very bluntly, they become cancers on an organization. And you got to do something about that. And I've always been amused by Vince Lombardi, the football coach of the Packers at the time, who the first day of practice would gather his team together and tell them what we were going to do. And then he said, those who are not fired with enthusiasm will be fired with enthusiasm. Two non-intuitive observations I'd like to share with you that I learned the hard way, but I think they're important. One is it's easier to change the culture of 17 companies or groups. In my case, it was companies. Lockheed Martin was made up of 17 companies that came together, major parts of companies, Lockheed Martin being just two of them. But it's easier to change 17 than two, because if you have two, they sit across the table from each other and say, we'll do it my way. And then the other one says, no, we'll do it my way. If they're 17 and somebody has the audacity to say, well, we'll do it the way we used to do it, 16 people say, well, why would you do that? And it turned out that it would lead to these discussions of how everybody used to do it. It turned out to be more important than anything that was on our balance sheet, was this ability to learn from 17 different organizations and create a brand new culture. There was no culture when we started. Build a brand new culture. And it was so powerful. And it was keyed to ideals and culture. The second was that, and I had been told this, that when it comes to making change, people are going to say, don't change too fast. You've got to give people a chance to get used to things. I mean, you've got to give time. Wrong answer. If you have to make change, make it fast, get it over with, and get on with the new world. So, and I guess another observation of when it comes to matters of character, unlike what they say on Wall Street, past performance is everything. It's the best indicator. And I'm going to summarize with just one word from the Hawaiian language. The word is pono. I don't speak Hawaiian. This was told to me. It's almost a religious word in the Hawaiian language, a revered word. And pono means do the right thing. And if we could all just adopt that, we'd be in pretty good shape. So for me, the right thing now is to stop talking and to thank you for inviting me. Take care.
Well, I hope there are some questions in the audience. We have a few minutes for questions. While you're thinking about them, I'm going to take the prerogative of saying something that probably I should have said earlier. As you can tell, UMB and this particular individual, we're very committed to these values. Having said that, I wouldn't want to give the impression that we are perfect people or that we're always a perfect institution. Of course we're not. And that, to me, is a demonstration of how important it is to have values. And why do I say that? You know, from time to time in my role, people come up to me and say, you know, this thing happened, or that person behaved this way, and Dr. Perman, that's not consistent with our values. Now, of course I'm chagrined about the issue at hand, but paradoxically, I want you to know how much it pleases me when somebody says it's not consistent with our values. That's why it's so important to have values. Questions for Norma Epstein? Anyone?
Far away.
Fellows?
I need to
I saw you taking notes. You can't completely give me a report at the end of the year that is his speech. I mean, you have to add it. Okay.
Since most of us are graduate students, how
Say who you are, please.
My name's Maeva. I'm a cybersecurity law grad student at the Carey School of Law.
Great.
And I applied for the research and writing track. My question is, as it relates to personal core values, my mentors have often told me, you know, have your vision statement, et cetera. How would you advise approaching that? You've spoken about that from a corporation perspective as a CEO, but how do you approach it from an individual perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, and I have to confess, I have never sat down and written down a set of values that I want to live by, to be honest. The closest I could come to that is the golden rule, which I find is a very good test. And the other thing is, this will sound a little strange, but I was a Boy Scout, and the Scout law is a pretty good statement of values. And I've thought of that on occasions. And when I've faced a tough decision that has a values connotation, and an awful lot of them do, it is just very helpful to stop and say, is this the honest thing to do? How does it affect people? Does it reflect loyalty? And you kind of go down that line. And then I've always asked myself, and this isn't a statement of values, it's a test of implementation. If my mother saw me do this, what would she say?
We know that.
That'd be tough. And if I read it in the front page of the New York Times, how would I like that? If somebody else did it to me, how would I feel about it? And I didn't begin to have a chance to tell you the many, many more examples of where we faced, either I faced as an individual. Since you asked, let me give an example. It's a good question. And I just been elected chairman of the National Academy of Engineering. And the person who was elected president, which is the full-time job, mine was just chair of the committee. The person who was elected president had run on a write-in ballot and had won by 14 votes. And the only other candidate was the one the board had recommended. And this person who came in winning by 14 votes, frankly, turned out to be a disaster in most every regard. And it was decided, the reason he got elected, I believe, most of the members of the Academy don't know each other. They live all over the country in different worlds. And so Dave Packard of Hewlett-Packard, a much admired man, perhaps the most admired engineer of his generation, Dave had written a letter to all the members for some reason saying this guy who's on the write-in candidate is a good guy, you ought to vote for him. And so I think most members voted for him. Anyway, he wins, it's a disaster. The board finally decides it's going to have to impeach the president of the outfit. Very embarrassing. This is an outfit that its charter traces itself all the way back to President Lincoln. And to make a long story short, we had to get a 2/3 vote, we the board, to get rid of this president. It wasn't clear we could get it because people didn't know what was happening. And so about 2 weeks before the vote, I get a letter from Dave Packard. It said, "Dear Norm, I've made a terrible mistake. You've got to get this guy out of there." And I thought, oh, this will settle it. I mean, there'll be no question that the members will impeach him. And 2 days later, Dave dies. So I now have this letter. It doesn't say "Dear members," it says "Dear Norm." And the academies are worth saving. They were on the verge of coming apart. And so here's a personal issue. Do I share the letter or don't I share the letter? And I decided that I shouldn't share the letter, and I didn't. We got the vote, a little over 2/3, and we've got a new president, and the academy are doing great. But it's just an example of a personal issue where the right answer wasn't totally obvious to me. And once again, I hope I got it right, if you can have a decent fielding average.
One final question, please.
Yes, I'm Mohammed Shabayek. I'm a faculty member in the School of Dentistry. I'm Egyptian. I joined the School of Dentistry just a month ago. You mentioned in your speech about the culture and the change of values. From your experience, okay, if you are just meeting someone who's from another culture and maybe from with another set of values, and he's joining your corporate, okay, what will be your advice for him just to quickly mingle and just adopt the new culture and agree to have the set of values of your institution?
Great question, and not one I've thought about. So, but it's a fair question. And I think my advice to that individual would be, first of all, to look at the values of the organization, hopefully they're stated somewhere, and say, do I want to affiliate myself with these values? Can I? If there's values you just can't affiliate yourself with, then one of the points I meant to make, you should never have a job you can't quit. I want to come back to that. But anyway, I think you want to make sure that you're comfortable with those values. If you are, you ought to adopt them. If there are additional values that you feel are absent, then I think not obtrusively, but work towards seeing if you can't get the values added or changed to better accommodate these things. I think of a lot of examples where there were totally different cultures that led to different values and good values on both sides, but led to strange things. Climbing Mount Everest, one of the American climbers had a real nice sweater and had hung it on his tent ropes to dry at night. He wrote this in a book. Next morning he comes out and one of the Sherpas is wearing his sweater. And the custom there was that if there was something you don't want, you leave it outside your tent. That was their value. And if you care about it, you keep it in the tent. And this person didn't, the American thought he'd stolen his sweater. The Sherpa thought it was a gift. And that kind of thing. And now I've forgotten what the other point was I wanted to make about, that's enough. Thank you.